He looked his father straight in the eye and said, "Dad, Hawaii's off. We can't afford it." The old man nodded, believing every word, canceling flights and swallowing his disappointment. But days later a photo appeared online. His son and in-laws laughing under the same palm trees he'd dreamed of. The lie hit harder than any punch. And when that same son came back asking for $100,000, the father handed him something that made his face go white. Viewers, what would you have done in his place? Comment below and subscribe for more shocking revenge stories that hit close to home. The call came on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind that smelled like rain and old regrets. Frank was sanding the porch rail when the phone buzzed in his pocket. He saw Ethan's name flash across the screen and felt that small warmth in his chest that only a parent knows, the kind that still flickers no matter how many times it's been dimmed. He wiped his hands on his jeans, answered with a smile in his voice. Ethan sounded composed, too composed. "Dad, listen." He began a rehearsed softness under every word about the Hawaii trip. "We might need to cancel." The pause that followed was perfectly timed, like a practice beat. Frank frowned. "Cancel? Why, everything's already booked." Ethan sighed, a sound so gentle it almost masked the manipulation behind it. "Work's cutting back. They're laying off a few people. I can't justify the expense right now, not when we've got the mortgage and Madison's student loans." Frank leaned against the railing, heart sinking but still steady. He knew that tone. It wasn't panic, it was presentation. But he didn't question it. Not yet. "You should have told me sooner," he said quietly. "I'd have helped." Ethan's voice softened further. "I know, Dad. You've done enough. We'll reschedule when things settle down." Then came that half-laugh, half-sigh people use when they want to sound brave. Frank looked out across the yard, the light dimming behind the trees. "You sure you're okay, son?" "I'm fine," Ethan replied quickly. Too quickly. After they hung up, the silence in the house grew heavy. The old clock in the hallway ticked too loud. Frank set the phone on the table and stood there for a long moment, staring at it like it might ring again with the truth. Hawaii had been his idea, a rare attempt to bring the family back together after years of missed dinners and short phone calls. The ocean, the sunsets, the easy laughter that used to fill his home when Ethan was still a boy, it was supposed to fix something that had quietly broken between them. That evening he packed away the bright floral shirts he'd bought, folded them carefully, then stopped halfway through and sat on the edge of the bed. The house felt larger than ever, the kind of empty that hums. He told himself Ethan was being responsible, that maybe he really was struggling. He poured himself a cup of decaf and stared at the steam rising, imagining his son at his kitchen table explaining the same story to Madison. But the details didn't sit right. Ethan had always been good with money. Smart, cautious, almost miserly at times. The man had once argued over a $30 late fee like it was a matter of life and death. A sudden crisis big enough to cancel an entire vacation didn't fit. Frank rubbed his temples and tried to shake off the unease. It wasn't the first time his instincts had whispered something he didn't want to hear. That night he dreamt of waves crashing against rocks, loud and relentless. When he woke, the house was silent again except for the hum of the refrigerator. He made breakfast, ate alone, and tried not to think about beaches or laughter. Still, he couldn't shake the image of Ethan's voice, calm, steady, perfectly measured. Over the next few days, small cracks began to show. Madison posted a photo on her social media of a new set of luggage. The caption read, "Finally getting away." It was vague, but the timing clawed at his gut. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, didn't want to be the paranoid old man reading too much into things. But he also knew his son knew when he was hiding something. He called Ethan 2 days later. "Just checking in," he said casually. Ethan's voice came through the line, cheerful, distracted. "Hey, Dad, sorry, can't talk long, big project at work." The lie slid out so easily it almost sounded true. Almost. Frank hung up, staring at the receiver. Something inside him twisted. He found himself walking through the house, stopping by the framed photos along the hallway, the fishing trip when Ethan was 10, his graduation, his wedding day. Each picture told a story of pride, of love, of a father who would have done anything for his son. Now each frame felt heavier, as if holding a truth he didn't want to face. By the weekend, the weather turned humid and the air carried that faint electric tension before a storm. Frank drove into town, bought groceries, and at the checkout counter overheard a clerk talking about her upcoming vacation Hawaii same week they'd planned. The word hit like static. That night he sat at his desk, turned on the computer, and typed Ethan's name into the search bar. What he saw next made his breath catch. A photo. Then another. Ethan and Madison smiling under palm trees, the ocean stretching blue behind them. The in-laws too, Gerald and Patricia, the same people who never once invited Frank to a single holiday dinner. They were all there, drinks in hand, leaves around their necks, not a trace of hardship in sight. The caption read, "Family time in paradise." He closed the laptop slowly, fingers trembling just enough to betray the storm inside. The lie wasn't about the money. It was about exclusion, about being erased from the picture of a family he helped build. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark with the lamp off, watching the faint reflection of the laptop screen against the window. Every minute that passed made the betrayal burn deeper until the hurt turned to something colder. The next morning, Ethan called again, casual, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, Dad," he said brightly, just checking in. "How are you holding up?" Frank answered evenly. "Doing fine." "How was work this week?" There was the faintest hitch in his son's breathing. "Busy, you know how it is." The words tasted sour. "Yeah," Frank said softly. "I do." After they hung up, he stared at the phone again, the same way he had before, but this time with a different kind of stillness. The kind that comes before a decision. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse, didn't cry. He just started making notes in a small leather-bound book, the same one he used for bills and repairs. Names, dates, screenshots printed and tucked between pages. He'd been a builder all his life. Houses, fences, foundations. He understood that the strongest structures could still collapse if you weakened them from the inside. And now he understood his son had built his life on borrowed wood and hollow promises. The call that had shattered his trust had done more than reveal a lie, it had given him clarity. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man who had been underestimated one time too many. And as he looked at the packed suitcase still sitting by the door, he smiled faintly. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because what came next wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be precise. And when it happened, no one, least of all Ethan, would ever forget who taught him how to build and how easily that same man could tear everything down. Frank had spent weeks preparing for the trip that would finally bring his fractured family back together. The suitcase in the corner of his bedroom was already half-packed. A neat array of pressed shirts, khaki shorts, and the loud Hawaiian prints he'd once sworn he'd never wear. He'd trimmed his hair, polished his old leather sandals, even ordered a new camera so he could capture his son's smile against the Pacific sunset. The walls of the house seemed lighter, then humming with quiet anticipation. He'd imagined the sound of laughter echoing through the hotel room, his grandkids splashing in the pool, his son tossing him a towel after a swim, both pretending the years of silence between them had never happened. For once, everything would feel right again. The day before the supposed flight, he went to pick up a box of macadamia chocolates, the kind Caroline used to love. He told himself Ethan's wife Madison would appreciate the gesture. She'd always been polite but distant, her eyes flicking toward Ethan for cues before she answered. Frank didn't mind. Family wasn't always easy, but it was all he'd ever wanted to hold on to. He even stopped by the post office to mail a few postcards to himself from Hawaii, planning to frame them later. Proof that the dream had finally happened, that he'd earned his peace. That night he sat at the kitchen table with his travel folder laid open. The flight confirmation, hotel, itinerary, rental car, all organized with precision, every page neatly clipped together. He was proud of himself for how smoothly it had come together. In the corner of his mind, he wondered if Ethan realized how much this meant to him. Not the island, not the palm trees, but the simple act of being invited back into his son's world. He thought about calling him again, maybe offering to cover the flight just in case, but pride kept him still. A father shouldn't have to buy his way into his son's life. He went to bed early. The suitcase zipped, the tickets printed and resting on the dresser. He dreamt of blue water and the smell of salt in the air. In his dream, Caroline was there too, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they watched the waves. She smiled and said, "You did good, Frank. You held the line." He woke up smiling, not realizing how cruelly that line was about to break. The next morning he brewed coffee, opened the blinds and waited for Ethan's call. Something short, maybe cheerful, confirming they'd rebook later in the year. Instead, there was silence. By afternoon, he checked his messages again, rereading the old one. "We'll make it up to you, Dad. Promise." He believed it. He wanted to. Hope can be a dangerous habit for a man who's lived long enough to know better. He filled his day with distractions, cleaning the gutters, mowing the lawn, pretending it didn't sting to see the unused luggage still sitting by the door. But the human heart isn't built to stay numb. By evening, the house felt too quiet again, the shadows growing long across the floorboards. He turned on the TV, flipping through channels. He didn't really see anything to drown the echo of his own thoughts. And then, without warning, that cruel truth struck. A ping from his phone. One of those mindless social notifications that usually meant nothing. But this one was different. He opened the photo and froze. Ethan, Madison, Gerald, and Patricia. The in-laws he barely knew. All smiling against the golden Hawaiian sky, leaves around their necks, glasses raised in celebration. The caption was bright, almost mocking. "Family time in paradise." His hand tightened around the phone until the plastic creaked. He scrolled through the album, photo after photo, the same resort name printed on the towels he had paid for months ago. His throat burned. He could almost hear Caroline's voice in the back of his mind. "Don't let your heart make excuses for people who already decided to forget you." He didn't move for a long time. The coffee on the table had gone cold. Outside, the streetlight flickered on, bathing the yard in weak amber. He replayed every detail of Ethan's voice during that phone call, the controlled calm, the careful pauses, the feigned guilt. Every second of it had been rehearsed. It wasn't a mistake. It was exclusion, pure and deliberate. He realized then that he hadn't just lost a vacation. He'd lost the illusion of family. He stood up slowly, like a man learning gravity all over again, walked to the mirror in the hallway and caught his own reflection. Tired eyes, graying hair, but still sharp, still alive. He straightened his shirt as if to remind himself who he was before all the lies. He wasn't going to beg for respect. Not anymore. He took the suitcase from the corner and placed it on the bed, unzipping it carefully. The shirt still smelled faintly of detergent and sun. He folded each one back into the drawer, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Then he took the travel folder, slid it into his desk drawer, and closed it. His jaw set. The sound of the latch clicking was final, like a door closing on something he'd never reopen. That night he poured himself a small glass of bourbon, the first in months, and sat by the window. The drink burned his throat, but the warmth steadied him. The ache inside had started to change shape from sorrow to something sharper. Determination. He picked up his notebook again, the same one where he tracked his expenses. But this time he didn't write numbers. He wrote a single line at the top of the page. "Everything they take, I'll make them pay for." Then he opened a fresh page, titled it Step 1, and began to write. Outside, a car passed by, headlights flashing across the wall. For a brief moment, his reflection glowed against the window pane, calm, collected, and utterly unreadable. He took another sip, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The night air felt different, heavy, electric. Because deep down, Frank knew something Ethan never would. When a builder takes something apart, he doesn't swing wildly. He removes one nail at a time. and by the time the last nail comes out, the whole house collapses in silence. Frank stared at the glowing screen, his hand frozen on the mouse. The photos filled his monitor one after another like punches he never saw coming. Ethan stood under the same palm trees Frank had spent weeks dreaming about, his arm around Madison as they laughed in the golden light of the same resort Frank had booked months ago. The same coral cliffs, the same blue horizon, the same dates printed in the corner of the photo's timestamp. Not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate lie. He could almost hear the echo of his son's calm voice from that phone call. "We just can't afford it, Dad." The words tasted different now, sour, poisoned. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, only the hum of crickets beneath the streetlight. He enlarged one of the photos. Madison held a cocktail with a bright pink umbrella, laughing beside her parents, Gerald and Patricia. Frank had never liked them. They were the kind of people who talked to waiters like servants and smiled only when someone richer entered the room. Gerald was wearing the same linen shirt Frank had bought for himself, the one still folded neatly in his drawer. His hand trembled slightly as he scrolled. There was Ethan again on a catamaran, sunglasses reflecting the sunset. A caption read, "A well-deserved break." Frank's jaw tightened. Deserved. The word stuck in his chest like a thorn. He had worked 40 years without a real vacation, building homes for other families, making sure his son had everything: a college degree, a car, a down payment on his first house. Now Ethan stood there relaxed and tan, celebrating on a beach that should have been theirs to share. Frank closed the laptop slowly, the soft click of the hinge louder than it should have been. His reflection flickered in the black screen eyes, hard mouth drawn into a thin line. He wasn't angry yet. Anger would have been easier. This was humiliation. Deep, cold humiliation that seeps into your bones and makes you feel small in your own home. He sat in silence, staring at the blank wall, his pulse thudding in his temples. He thought about calling Ethan, demanding an explanation, but the image of that smug smile in the photo stopped him. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window. The reflection of the laptop still glowed faintly in the other room, a ghost he couldn't shake. The refrigerator hummed steady and oblivious. Frank remembered the way his son used to hug him, the weight of that small body against his chest when Ethan was 5, clinging after scraping his knee. He wondered when that boy had disappeared, when the man in those photos had replaced him. Hours passed, but Frank didn't move. The photos replayed in his head, each one carving deeper. By midnight, the glass of water had gone untouched. He walked to the hall, looked at the family pictures again. His late wife Caroline smiling with Ethan at his high school graduation. The same pride that had once filled Frank's chest now felt like a mockery. He whispered her name under his breath, his voice almost breaking. "You'd know what to say," he murmured. But Caroline wasn't there. Only the quiet, heavy truth was. At 2 a.m., he opened the laptop again, his hands steady now. He went through every photo, carefully noting the background, the dates, the people tagged. The resort name appeared in one of the posts, Makana Sands. He looked it up. It was the exact same one he'd booked. Same flight dates, same tour company, even the same suite number listed in the reservation confirmation he still had printed in a folder. He felt something twist deep inside him, a slow, deliberate tightening. This wasn't thoughtless. It was orchestrated. Frank turned off the light and sat in the dark, lit only by the faint glow from the street outside. His humiliation began to harden into something colder, cleaner. The way metal cools after being forged. His son hadn't just lied. He'd erased him. Chosen comfort over conscience. Image over integrity. And that realization did something irreversible. He stood up and walked to the garage. The smell of motor oil and dust greeted him, familiar and grounding. On the workbench lay his old wooden toolbox, the one his father had given him decades ago. He opened it, running a finger over the tools arranged neatly inside each one, worn smooth by years of use. The world had changed, but he hadn't. He was still the man who fixed things. Only now what needed fixing wasn't a house or a fence. It was the imbalance that his son had created. He spent the rest of the night pacing the house calm and deliberate. There were no outbursts, no shouts, no broken glass, only thought, precision. He remembered Ethan's voice that practiced ease, the way he spoke about work stress and finances. Lies stacked like bricks, one on top of another, until they built a wall high enough to shut him out completely. But Frank knew walls. He knew how to take them down quietly and piece by piece. When morning came, he brewed coffee strong and black. The world outside had no idea anything had shifted. The birds sang. A jogger passed. The mail truck rattled down the street. Frank sat at the table, calm, methodical, his eyes clearer than they had been in years. He took out his checkbook, opened his laptop again, and logged into his accounts. He didn't touch a thing yet. Just looked, observed, measured. In one of the photos, Ethan was wearing a watch Frank had gifted him on his wedding day, a gold Seiko engraved with a single word, legacy. It caught the sunlight gleaming proudly on his wrist. Frank stared at that detail longer than any other. That watch was supposed to remind Ethan where he came from, who had given him everything he stood on. But now it was just decoration. Frank closed the browser and leaned back. He had raised a man who thought deceit was cleverness, who believed manipulation was a skill. The quiet realization settled in like the final nail in a coffin. His son had mistaken kindness for weakness. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and smiled faintly. The humiliation was gone. What remained was focus, a builder's patience. He picked up his pen and drew a small mark on the corner of his notebook right under the words Step 1. Because if Ethan thought the lie ended in Hawaii, he was about to learn just how long a father's memory could last, and how quietly justice can move when it wears the face of calm. The next morning, Frank woke with the same heaviness that had carried him through the night before, but something in him had changed shape. The ache hadn't vanished, it had crystallized into focus. He brewed his coffee in silence, watching the steam rise and twist in the sunlight. No music, no TV, just the rhythmic drip of the pot. Every sound felt amplified, deliberate. He was done feeling humiliated. Done replaying his son's lies like some sad old man begging for closure. Now he wanted precision, order, proof. He carried his mug to the study, sat at the desk, and opened the laptop. The login screen glowed in the dim light. He typed his password slowly, like a man opening a safe. Then, one by one, he began collecting. The photos, the dates, the comments under each smiling snapshot. Madison's post tagging the resort. Patricia's caption, "Best family trip ever." Gerald's stupid joke about sunburn. Each one a nail in the coffin of their little performance. He saved them all, screenshots stacked neatly in a folder named Expenses, because that's what they were to him now, receipts. By mid-morning, he'd printed everything. The whir of the printer was steady, comforting. He punched holes into the stack of pages and slid them into a binder, labeled it with a piece of masking tape. McKenna Sands. When he closed it, he exhaled steady and measured. The kind of exhale that comes after making a decision you don't intend to take back. He wasn't angry, not in the loud way. It was colder than that, cleaner. Decades in construction and property development had taught him that emotions were expensive. A man who let them control his hands made sloppy work. So he put the pain in its place behind glass where he could study it without letting it drive the nail crooked. He spent the afternoon in his office pulling up old financial records. The trust account, the deeds, the insurance policies, everything Ethan didn't know existed. Frank had built his life on details, contracts, clauses, contingencies. It was time to use that same precision not to build, but to dismantle. He remembered something his mentor used to say, "Never start a job without knowing where the weak point is." Frank smiled faintly at the memory. He knew Ethan's weak points. Pride, dependence, the illusion of control. His son liked to think he'd inherited his father's confidence, but all he'd taken was his generosity. And generosity, Frank decided, was about to run dry. At noon he made lunch but barely ate. The air smelled of dust and printer ink. A thin layer of sunlight crept across the table where the binder sat. He flipped it open again, adding timestamps beside each screenshot like evidence in a case. He highlighted every mention of the trip, April 14th, Makana Sands Resort, Ocean View Suite 203. Exact matches to his original booking. He'd kept every receipt, every email confirmation. Side by side, the truth formed a pattern too perfect to ignore. When the phone rang, he let it buzz twice before picking up. Ethan's name lit the screen. Frank stared at it, then pressed answer. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said, his tone easy rehearsed again. "Just checking in. You doing okay?" Frank said nothing at first, only listened to the faint hum of wind on the other end. Then he replied, calm as glass. "I'm doing fine. You back from your little getaway?" The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. Ethan hesitated just a second too long. "Getaway," he said, voice tightening. "I told you we canceled." Frank smiled without warmth. "Sure you did." He hung up before the lie could finish forming. The phone buzzed again almost immediately, but he ignored it. He didn't need an explanation. He had the truth, and the truth didn't argue. He closed the binder, locked it in his drawer, and leaned back. The satisfaction wasn't joy, it was precision, like watching a level settle perfectly between two lines. That evening he drove into town. The sky was pale orange, the roads quiet. He stopped at the hardware store, bought a new ledger, and a set of pens. The cashier, a kid barely 20, smiled and said, "Planning a project." Frank gave a small nod. "Something like that." He drove home with the windows down, the cool wind brushing against his face. Back at the house, he sat down and opened the new ledger. The first page read simply, "Corrections." Underneath, he started listing everything his son had taken for granted, the mortgage payments he'd quietly covered, the emergency checks, the down payment for Ethan's first house. Each line item was a reminder that generosity without gratitude was just financing betrayal. By nightfall, the plan was no longer forming. It was written. Simple steps. Controlled, methodical, untraceable until it was done. He'd revise his estate, reassign assets, protect the legacy from the same hands that tried to steal it. He wasn't going to ruin Ethan's life. No, that would be too dramatic, too merciful. He was going to teach him what it felt like to build on borrowed ground and then watch it crumble. Frank stood by the window, the night stretching wide and silent. The neighborhood slept. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, once then stopped. He could see his reflection faintly in the glass, calm, steady, untouchable. He didn't look like a man plotting revenge. He looked like someone who'd already accepted what needed to be done. He thought of Caroline again, her voice soft in memory. She used to say, "When people show you who they are, believe them." He had believed Ethan for too long. Now he believed what the photos showed instead. He switched off the lamp, leaving the binder on the desk, the ledger open beside it. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. As he walked down the hallway, he paused by the family photos one last time. His son's smile stared back at him, frozen in better years. Frank touched the frame lightly, then turned away. Upstairs, the house groaned under the weight of time, a familiar sound he'd always found comforting. But tonight it felt different, like the house itself knew something had shifted. He climbed into bed, the darkness pressing gently against the room. Sleep came slow but deep, the kind that carries purpose. In the stillness, one thought pulsed quietly behind his closed eyes. This wasn't anger anymore. This was architecture, the blueprint of justice drawn by a steady hand. And when morning came, the first step would begin quietly, precisely, without a single word wasted. Ethan showed up on a Sunday afternoon carrying a smile so polished it almost shined. He had a pie from some overpriced bakery and the kind of voice that tried too hard to sound casual. "Hey, Dad, thought I'd stop by, see how you're doing." Frank opened the door just wide enough to make him wait. The smell of cologne hit first sharp and artificial. He nodded once and stepped aside. "Come in." Ethan moved through the house like he owned it, his shoes echoing against the hardwood, his eyes scanning the room for signs of hostility. Frank stayed a few steps behind, watching every motion, the way Ethan touched the back of a chair, the way he smiled without meeting his father's gaze. It was a performance one Frank had seen before, only this time he wasn't the audience. He was the director. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight filtering through the blinds, striping the counter in gold and shadow. Frank poured coffee without asking. Ethan thanked him too quickly. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking clock filled the silence. Then Ethan broke it. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Everything okay?" Frank studied his son's face, the same one he'd once looked at through a hospital nursery window, tiny and red and full of promise. Now that face looked tired from too much pretending. "I'm fine," Frank said evenly. "How about you? How was your trip?" Ethan blinked the question, landing heavier than it should have. "Trip," he repeated, feigning confusion. "What trip?" Frank sipped his coffee. "The one with palm trees and ocean views? Looked like a nice place." A flicker of panic crossed Ethan's face before he smoothed it away with a laugh. "Oh, Hawaii. Yeah, Madison's parents surprised us. Last-minute thing." Frank nodded slowly, setting his mug down. "Funny. Same week as ours would have been. Same resort, too. Small world." The words hung in the air like the edge of a blade. Ethan's grin faltered. He looked down at the table, tracing invisible lines with his finger. "Dad, I wanted to tell you, but things have been crazy. Madison's folks insisted. I didn't want to make you feel bad." Frank leaned back, his chair creaking softly. "Didn't want to make me feel bad or didn't want me there?" Ethan looked up sharply, his eyes flashing defensiveness before softening again. "Come on, Dad, don't make it sound like that." Frank didn't answer. He let the silence stretch until Ethan shifted in his seat, adjusting his shirt cuffs, pretending to find comfort in the movement. The younger man's charm was slipping thread by thread. "So Frank said," finally, his tone mild, almost curious, "was work still laying people off that week? Or did they move the schedule around?" Ethan hesitated. "What you said, they were cutting jobs. That's why you couldn't afford the trip." "Oh. Right. Yeah, they delayed it. Company's restructuring." Frank tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a craftsman inspects a warped piece of wood. "Restructuring," he repeated. "Sounds stressful." Ethan nodded too fast. "Yeah, real stressful." Frank reached over to the counter, sliding a printed photo across the table. Ethan's smile froze. It was the one with him and Madison on the catamaran. Drinks raised the words, "Best Family Vacation," stamped across the caption. "You look happy," Frank said quietly. "That doesn't look stressful." Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. His fingers twitched against the photo. "Dad, I can explain." "No need," Frank said, cutting him off. "You don't owe me an explanation. You made your choice. I'd just like to know when someone lies straight to my face. Helps me keep the record straight." The words landed without heat, calm and precise. Ethan looked smaller now, shoulders hunched, that easy charm gone. "I didn't mean to." Frank raised a hand. "You didn't mean to. What lie exclude me?" "Spend the money I sent you for the mortgage on plane tickets and champagne." Ethan flinched. "I was going to pay you back." Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, steadier. "No, you weren't." The air between them went still. Ethan tried to smile again, but it didn't fit his face anymore. "Look, I messed up. I should have been honest. But you've got to understand. Madison's parents wanted Frank cut, in his tone sharp enough to stop him mid-sentence. I don't care what they wanted. I care that you thought you could treat me like a fool and still come back for more." Ethan's head jerked up. "More money," Frank said simply. "That's what this visit's about, isn't it?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. He looked down, then forced a laugh that cracked halfway through. "It's just a loan, Dad. A temporary thing. You've helped before. Not anymore." Ethan stared at him, disbelief breaking through the mask. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Frank said, rising slowly, "that the bank's closed. Permanently." He walked to the counter, poured himself more coffee, then turned back. "You should have been honest. You could have had more than money. You could have had respect." Ethan stood too, the charm gone, replaced by a flash of anger. "You're really going to throw away family over one mistake?" Frank looked at him for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "No, son. You did that all by yourself." For a second, neither moved. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock. Then Ethan grabbed his jacket, muttering something under his breath, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a dull click. Frank stood there, staring at the empty chair, the photo still lying on the table. The late afternoon light spilled through the blinds, painting long stripes across the floor. He picked up the picture, turned it over, and wrote a single date on the back in neat, steady handwriting. Then he placed it inside the binder with the rest. He wasn't angry, not even sad anymore. Just focused. The kind of focus that comes before the first swing of a hammer. Outside, Ethan's car roared down the street, tires screeching as he sped away. Frank watched from the window, calm and unshaken. When the sound finally faded, he whispered to himself, "That's step 2. And as the light dimmed, his reflection in the glass looked nothing like a man defeated. It looked like someone who had just found the perfect place to strike next. Ethan came back 2 weeks later, the same grin nailed onto his face like a salesman's badge. He carried a folder under his arm, a sleek leather briefcase that looked borrowed and the kind of energy people wear when they've practiced their lines in the mirror. Frank saw him through the window before the knock came. The timing was perfect, the performance predictable. He opened the door without surprise, stepping aside just enough to let him in. "Dad," Ethan said brightly, "I've been thinking about something that could change everything for both of us." Frank said nothing, only motioned toward the table. Ethan spread out his papers with a flourish, charts, numbers, and photos of gleaming coffee shops with smiling baristas. "A franchise," he said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "It's a new brand out of Seattle, artisan blends, sustainable sourcing, sleek design. I'm talking high-end coffee for high-end neighborhoods." Frank poured himself a cup of actual coffee, black and strong, and listened. He didn't interrupt. The way Ethan's words tumbled out, sharp and confident, almost hypnotic, reminded him of late-night infomercials promising miracles for a small price. Ethan leaned forward, tapping one page with his pen. "They're expanding fast. I've already spoken to a regional rep. They love my background, my management experience. I could run one of these places like a machine, but I need startup capital, equipment, branding fees, initial stock. Around $100,000. I know it's a lot, but with your help, Dad, this could secure our future. Our family's future." Frank nodded slowly, eyes fixed on his son's face. He could see the faint sheen of sweat gathering near Ethan's temple, the over-rehearsed gestures, the perfect pacing of a man who's pitched the story before. $100,000. Frank repeated, his tone neutral. Ethan smiled, mistaking calm for interest. "I'll pay you back within a year, guaranteed. I'll even add 10% interest if that makes you feel better. I've run the numbers. The returns are insane." Frank sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. He let Ethan talk. The words spilled faster now, phrases like exclusive territory, investment opportunity, family legacy. He'd even tossed in a line about how much his late mother would have believed in the idea. That one landed like a cheap shot. Frank didn't flinch. When the pitch finally ran out of air, Ethan sat back, flashing his practiced grin again. So he said, "What do you think?" Frank placed his cup down carefully, the sound soft but deliberate. "Tell me about the franchise," he said. "What's it called?" Ethan blinked, surprised. It's called Brewhaven, or maybe Brewhouse. I'll double-check the spelling." Frank's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You'll double-check the name of the business you want $100,000 for?" Ethan chuckled nervously. Well, they're rebranding. You know how startups are. Of course, Frank said, leaning back. And this regional rep, what's his name, Derek, Ethan said too quickly. Derek, Miller, I think. You think, Frank echoed softly. Ethan shifted his charm, slipping an inch. Look, Dad, it's not about the details. It's about vision. You taught me that. I taught you to measure twice before you cut. Frank said, his voice calm but razor sharp. Ethan laughed, but it sounded thin. Come on, Dad, don't get all suspicious. I'm your son. Frank looked at him steadily. That's the only reason I'm listening. The silence that followed stretched tight across the room. Ethan's hand drifted to his folder, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. Frank noticed how his son's watch, a gift from him years ago, caught the light gleaming against the tension in his wrist. You know, Frank said quietly, I looked up something last night. Coffee franchises, licensing fees, startup costs. There's no brew haven, no brew house. Nothing with that name exists. You didn't talk to a rep. You didn't talk to anyone. Ethan froze. His lips parted, searching for the next lie, but none came. Frank's tone didn't change. You drove all the way here to ask for money you weren't going to use for coffee. So tell me, was it gambling debt this time, Madison's credit cards? Or did you finally find something new to waste on? Ethan's mouth hardened. You think you know everything, don't you? You don't understand what it's like trying to make something of yourself without help. Frank's laugh was quiet, but it carried weight. Without help. You've had nothing but help. You just never learned to stand on it without slipping. Ethan slammed his hands on the table. You don't get it. I'm trying to fix things. Frank didn't move. By lying, Ethan's anger cracked into desperation. Dad, please. This isn't about lies. It's about trust. Frank's eyes sharpened. Trust? He leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. You looked me in the eye and lied about losing your job. You lied about Hawaii. You lied about the money. And now you sit here talking about trust. Ethan's shoulders dropped. The confidence that once filled the room drained out of him, leaving only a man who'd run out of performance. I just need a chance, he said quietly. Frank studied him for a long moment. You've had every chance. But the thing about chances, Ethan, they're like credit. Eventually they run out. He stood, walked to the cabinet, and came back with an envelope. He placed it on the table between them. Ethan stared at it like it might save him. Frank's voice stayed steady. Inside is a list of every dollar I've given you in the past 10 years. Every loan, every bailout, every lie I told myself to believe you'd change. I suggest you look at it before asking me for more. Ethan didn't open it. He just sat there silent. Frank leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You said this business would secure our future. You're right about that. Because starting today, your future doesn't include my wallet. Ethan finally stood, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. You'll regret this, he muttered. Frank didn't look up. No, he said softly. I already did. The door closed behind him and the house fell silent again. Frank stayed there for a long moment, staring at the empty chair. Then he walked over to the window, watching Ethan's car pull away for what felt like the last time. He turned back to the table, the folder still lying open, the fake numbers staring up like evidence. He gathered the pages, stacked them neatly, and slid them into the binder beside the others. Then he opened his ledger and wrote 3 words under Step 2, no more negotiations. Outside, thunder rolled low in the distance. Frank didn't flinch. He looked at the darkening sky and felt nothing but clarity. Because next time Ethan came asking for something, it wouldn't be money he'd find waiting for him. It would be consequence. The paper sat on the table like a quiet verdict. Frank ran a finger over the edge of the folder, smooth and heavy with finality. The ink was still fresh, the signatures bold. His lawyer, an old friend from his Army days named Keller, had handled the last of the filings that morning. The trust was now irrevocable. Every dollar, every property deed, every share of his company, all transferred to a veterans charity he'd supported for decades. His life's work would help men who'd earned it, not the son who'd tried to sell it for a beach vacation and a lie. The afternoon sun poured through the blinds, streaking the kitchen with bars of gold. It was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional shuffle of paper. He wasn't angry anymore. That stage had long passed. What filled him now was something sharper and cleaner, justice without the heat of vengeance. He had reclaimed the only thing Ethan couldn't fake: dignity. When the knock came, Frank didn't even glance up. He knew the rhythm of that knock, 3 quick taps, 1 pause, then another. The rhythm of a man pretending confidence. He took a long sip of coffee before answering. Ethan stood at the door, looking rehearsed again. Pressed shirt, polished shoes, that same desperate smile that had grown thinner each visit. "Hey, Dad," he said, trying to sound casual. "Got a minute?" Frank stepped aside without a word. Ethan entered, his eyes scanning the room like he was trying to read a forecast. "Listen," he began, setting down his jacket. "I wanted to talk about that investment thing again. I know you were skeptical, but I've worked it out with the investors. They just need one more confirmation and I can lock it in." Frank watched him with the calm of a man who already knew the ending to the story being told. "Sit down," he said quietly. Ethan hesitated but obeyed. Frank opened the folder on the table, sliding the top document toward him. The sound of paper against wood was the only sound in the room. "What's this?" Ethan asked, forcing a grin. "Read it." Ethan's eyes darted across the page. At first he didn't understand what he was seeing. Legal language, clauses, trust, details, signatures. His brow furrowed. "Wait, what is this?" "It's my estate," Frank said. "Every asset, every property, every cent. Moved into a charitable trust this morning. Irrevocable." Ethan blinked, confusion shifting into disbelief. You transferred everything to who? To people who deserve it." Ethan's face flushed. "You're joking." Frank's gaze was steady. "You think I joke about contracts?" Ethan pushed the papers away. "Dad, you can't do this. You're cutting me out." Frank's voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. I'm correcting a mistake." Ethan laughed, but the sound was hollow. "This is insane. You worked your whole life for this family, for me." "No," Frank said. "I worked my whole life for what was right. And somewhere along the way, I confused that with you." Ethan stood pacing. "You can't just give it all away." "What about Mom's memory? What about what she would have wanted?" Frank's eyes hardened. "Caroline would have wanted you to have character, not comfort. She'd have given everything for that." The words landed like a blow. Ethan stopped moving, staring at his father across the table. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "You'll regret this." Frank folded his hands. "Maybe, but at least I'll regret it as a man who doesn't sell himself cheap." Ethan's control cracked. "I'm your son," he shouted. "You can't just erase me." Frank's expression didn't change. "You erased yourself the moment you decided I was just an ATM with a heartbeat." The silence after that was long and sharp, the kind that makes the air feel heavy. Ethan looked down at the documents again, scanning them as if he could undo the ink with his eyes. "You'll die alone," he muttered finally. Frank gave a faint smile. "No, I'll die honest. That's a better trade than you'll ever make." Ethan snatched the folder and flipped through the pages again, desperate for a loophole. He stopped when he reached the charity's name, the embossed seal at the bottom. Veterans Honor Foundation. A photo of his father in uniform hung on the wall just above the table. He looked at it, then back at Frank, disbelief flickering into something colder, resentment. "So that's it," he said, voice low. "You'd rather give it all to strangers than your own blood." "They're not strangers," Frank said. "They fought for something bigger than themselves. You fought for convenience." Ethan's face twisted. "You think you're teaching me a lesson? You're just punishing me because you're lonely." Frank stood then, the chair scraping against the tile. He was taller than Ethan remembered. Stronger, too, not in body, but in presence. "No," he said quietly. "I'm protecting what's left of my name. You spent yours." Ethan grabbed his jacket, hands shaking. "You'll regret this," he repeated, but the words had lost their weight. Frank followed him to the door, opened it wide. "Maybe," he said again, "but not tonight." Ethan hesitated on the porch, the late afternoon light washing over his face. For a split second, Frank thought he might say something, an apology, a plea, anything. But instead, Ethan turned and walked to his car without another word. The engine roared, the tires screeched, and then he was gone. Frank stood in the doorway for a while, the wind tugging softly at his shirt. He looked down at the empty driveway, then back at the table where the document still lay. Everything was where it should be. Clean. Final. He picked up the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it. The click was quiet, but it carried the weight of an ending. As the evening light deepened, he walked to the living room, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and sat in his old chair. The taste burned, but it felt earned. The house was silent again, but this silence wasn't lonely. It was earned peace. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. Frank leaned back, letting the sound of it fill the room. He thought of Caroline, of the promise he'd once made to live with integrity no matter what it cost. He smiled slow and steady. Because in the end, he hadn't lost a son. He'd just stopped financing a stranger. And as the first drops hit the window, he whispered to himself, "Step 3, done." The first letter arrived by courier, thick paper stamped with an expensive firm's crest. Ethan and his in-laws had filed a formal notice. They were challenging the trust. Their claim wasn't about greed, it was about Frank's mind. They accused him of incompetence, of being too old, too confused, too easily manipulated when he signed the papers transferring everything to charity. It was the dirtiest move yet. Frank sat at his kitchen table rereading the letter until the words blurred. They weren't just trying to steal his money now. They were trying to erase his sanity. His attorney, Richard Chen, was unshaken. "Standard intimidation tactics," he said, red pen marking key phrases on the letter. "They're betting you'll fold to avoid court, but we'll get ahead of it." The plan unfolded with military precision, 3 separate evaluations from physicians, a neurologist and a psychologist. Each confirmed his full competency and sound judgment. The timeline of the trust was airtight, established days before Ethan's request for the $100,000 investment. Every page proved logic, not revenge. Frank complied with every test. He endured hours of memory drills, reasoning puzzles, and written exams under fluorescent lights. Each time the doctors asked the same question, "Why are you here?" His answer never changed. "Because my family is claiming I'm mentally unfit to protect my own name." The psychologist's report was blunt. No evidence of cognitive decline, depression, or impaired judgment. Subject demonstrates consistent reasoning and emotional control. Chen assembled everything: medical evaluations, signed witness statements, digital evidence of Ethan's lies, and Tom Bradley's notarized affidavit exposing the fake franchise scheme. Tom had overheard Ethan's father-in-law bragging about a renovation and boat funded by the promised money. The web unraveled. When the formal response went out, it was cold and precise, all accusations baseless, all documentation enclosed. The letter concluded, "Any litigation will be vigorously defended. Should we prevail, we will pursue recovery of attorney's fees under Arizona law for frivolous claims." It was both a warning and a promise. Ethan's side didn't back down right away. They sent a second letter, longer, angrier, demanding that Frank rescind the trust for the sake of family harmony. He ignored it. Days later, his phone rang. Ethan's wife, Madison, on the line, voice trembling with fake restraint. "Frank, this is getting out of hand. We can settle this quietly." He hung up before she finished the sentence. 2 weeks later, silence broke. A courier delivered a new letter, this one shorter. The lawsuit was withdrawn upon further review of circumstances and evidence. Translation: they'd seen the evaluations, the affidavits, the timeline. Their lawyer knew they'd lose and face sanctions for pursuing a frivolous case. Frank read it once, then folded it neatly and slid it into his binder, marked defense. But victory wasn't just in ink and signatures, it came with quiet satisfaction. He imagined Ethan and his in-laws around a polished dining table, whispering, blaming one another, wondering how the old man had outplayed them. He pictured Glenn, the smooth-talking father-in-law, realizing his influence meant nothing against a wall of evidence. That image alone was worth every sleepless night. Still, he knew the legal retreat didn't mean peace. Manipulators never stop when they lose power. They shift tactics. And as he set the binder back on the shelf, his phone buzzed again, a message from Ethan. "Dad, can we talk?" "No lawyers, just us." Frank stared at the screen, unmoving. He'd already learned that the first sign of defeat in people like Ethan was the word us. It was never about reconciliation. It was always the setup for the next move. He deleted the message and turned off the phone. Outside, dusk settled over the yard, the air still after a long storm. The house felt lighter now, no longer haunted by guilt or confusion. Everything that mattered was documented, sealed, and legal. The truth was intact, the lies exposed, and the family's last weapon, doubt, disarmed. He stood by the window, watching the reflection of his own steady face against the fading light. For the first time in years, he didn't feel old. He felt deliberate, vindicated. And as he locked the binder away, a faint smile touched his lips. The war wasn't over yet, but the battlefield was finally his. The next move, he decided, would be personal. Months passed, and the storm finally broke into silence. The legal letters stopped coming. The phone stopped buzzing with guilt-laced messages. Even the neighbors who had whispered and speculated during the scandal went back to mowing their lawns, pretending they hadn't noticed the quiet victory inside the small house at the end of the street. Frank lived his days simply: coffee at dawn, a walk through the neighborhood, a few hours of woodworking in the garage, where the smell of cedar and varnish replaced the bitter scent of betrayal. The binder with all the evidence now sat in a locked drawer, untouched for weeks. He didn't need to see it anymore. The truth had done its job. One morning, while cleaning the desk, he found the old travel brochure, Hawaii, folded and worn, the corners soft from the number of times he'd picked it up only to put it back down. He unfolded it and smoothed the creases. The photos looked the same: blue water, gold sand waves curling like glass. The same place that had once been the scene of humiliation was now nothing more than a place again, no longer haunted by faces smiling under false pretenses. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was an open road. He opened his laptop and typed "flights to Maui." The search results loaded, showing round-trip tickets, early morning departures, beachfront rentals. He scrolled for a long time, not rushing the decision, enjoying the simple act of choice. When he finally clicked book, the confirmation page appeared, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt since Caroline died: ease. He packed light. A few shirts, shorts, sunscreen, a camera he'd barely used. As he zipped the bag, he thought about the first time he'd packed for this trip. The shirts folded too carefully, the hope folded between them. This time, there was no hope left to bruise. Just peace. On the morning of the flight, he woke before dawn. The house was still, the air cool. He stood by the window, coffee steaming in his hand, watching the horizon turn gray, then pink. The world didn't feel empty anymore. Just quiet in the best possible way. The flight was smooth, the kind of quiet hum that puts you between worlds. He stared out the window, watching clouds drift below the vast Pacific, stretching out in every direction. The last time he'd imagined this view, it had been attached to disappointment. Now it felt like redemption earned, not given. When he landed, Maui greeted him with warmth. The air smelled of salt and flowers, heavy and alive. He checked into a small inn overlooking the beach. Nothing fancy, just clean and quiet. The woman at the front desk handed him a key and said, "Welcome home," without knowing how right she was. That evening he sat at a beachside cafe, the sound of waves folding softly against the shore. The sun melted into the horizon, painting the water gold. He took a slow sip of coffee, the irony not lost on him. Across the street, a young couple argued playfully about directions, laughing as they got lost in their own confusion. He smiled, not bitterly this time, but warmly. He'd once been like that, full of plans, full of trust. Later, he walked along the shoreline, the cool sand sinking beneath his feet. Every step felt lighter, as if he was walking out of the shadow of something that no longer existed. He thought of Ethan, of Madison, of the in-laws, whose names no longer mattered. He wondered if they'd ever stop to realize that all their scheming had achieved nothing. Or maybe they were still at it, still blaming, still spinning stories to each other in dimly lit rooms. It didn't matter. Their noise couldn't reach him anymore. He paused where the water met his ankles, letting the tide wash over his feet, cold and clean. For the first time, he didn't feel old. He felt alive. Every decision, every sleepless night, every painful truth had led to this standing under a sunset no one could take from him. The Veterans Charity had sent him updates every month. He read them all. A new housing project built in Arizona. A rehabilitation center expanded in Denver. His money had turned into something real, something that breathed and grew. Lives changed. Futures rebuilt. That was legacy. That was revenge that mattered. He sat down on the sand, watching the waves pulse in and out like the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The moon began to rise, silver light cutting through the last of the sunset. He thought of Caroline, then not in sorrow, but in gratitude. She would have understood. She always had. When he returned to the inn, he took out his notebook, the one that had once been filled with numbered steps and strategies. Now most of the pages were blank. He flipped to the last one and wrote, "Step 4, live well." Then he closed it and left it on the nightstand, the ink still drying in the salt-heavy air. The next morning he rented a small car and drove up the coast. The road wound through cliffs and open sky. Locals waved as he passed, and he waved back. He stopped at a roadside fruit stand, bought a cup of pineapple slices, and ate them slowly, watching the sea below. Each bite was sharp, sweet, and honest. Nothing like the life he'd been living before. At a lookout point, he parked and stood by the railing, the wind whipping through his hair. Below him, the ocean roared against black volcanic rock, endless and unconcerned. That was the world's way of saying everything ends and everything begins again. He stayed until sunset, until the light burned orange across the water, then turned back toward the inn. The radio played softly some old country song about forgiveness and roads that never quite end. He didn't sing along, but the words fit the quiet between his thoughts. That night he wrote a letter. It wasn't to Ethan. It wasn't to anyone in particular. It was a letter to himself, dated and signed a record of survival. You kept your name, your mind, and your peace. That's all that matters. The rest was noise. He folded the letter and slipped it into his passport, a keepsake for the next trip, wherever that might be. Before turning out the lights, he looked once more at the horizon through the open window. The wind carried the scent of plumeria and salt. He closed his eyes and breathed it in slow and deep. For the first time in a very long time, Frank wasn't waiting for anyone's apology, approval, or return. He wasn't anyone's father, benefactor, or target. He was just a man who'd chosen truth over comfort and peace over blood. The sound of the waves outside was steady, certain, eternal. He smiled faintly and whispered to the dark Step 4 complete. And as the ocean breathed beneath his window, he realized revenge had never been about destruction. It had been about reclamation. His life was his again, and this time he wasn't giving it away. As people grow older, they often realize that peace doesn't come from winning arguments or holding grudges. It comes from letting go of what no longer deserves your energy. Frank's story reminds us that true revenge isn't about hurting those who hurt us. It's about reclaiming dignity, protecting what we've built, and refusing to let deceit define our final years. Sometimes love must be replaced with boundaries, and silence can speak louder than confrontation. Life after betrayal can still be beautiful when you choose integrity over anger and independence over dependence. Age isn't a weakness, it's clarity earned through time. You don't owe anyone your trust, you owe yourself peace. If you've ever been taken for granted or had someone mistake your kindness for weakness, remember, walking away is its own kind of justice. Live well, love wisely, and never let betrayal rewrite your worth. Subscribe for more powerful revenge stories that remind us justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply living free.